measurable corruption, oversight failures, and structural risk within U.S. government agencies. This is an investigative report prepared as an evidence-based analytical review. There is no single measurable percentage that captures total corruption within U.S. governments or federal agencies. And this isn't due to lack of concern, but because corruption is inherently hidden, unevenly detected, and inconsistently prosecuted. However, using measurable indicators including criminal convictions, oversight findings, program risk assessments, and public trust data, a clear pattern emerges. Corruption exists at a persistent, non-trivial level. Oversight is fragmented and reactive, and research consistently shows that stronger, more independent, and more transparent oversight correlates with lower corruption outcomes. The U.S. Department of Justice annually reports hundreds of public corruption convictions across federal, state, and local governments. These cases overwhelmingly involve fraud, bribery, extortion, and conspiracy. Convictions represent only detected and successfully prosecuted cases, not the total incidents. Conviction data confirms corruption exists, but it cannot be used to calculate prevalence because detection probability is unknown and uneven. The Government Accountability Office, or the GAO, maintains a high-risk list identifying federal programs that are vulnerable to fraud, to waste, to abuse, and to mismanagement. Recent reports identify 30-plus major federal programs and agencies as high risk. These include defense contracting, healthcare, so Medicare and Medicaid, emergency relief funding, federal prison system, and IT modernization and cybersecurity. These designations are official acknowledgments of systemic vulnerabilities, not accusations, but they do demonstrate where corruption risk is structurally elevated. Every major federal agency has an Office of Inspector General, and it is tasked with audits, investigations, and evaluations. The measurable facts of the Inspector General data shows the IG office reports billions of dollars annually in questioned costs, improper payments, or recoveries. Many inspector generals report limited enforcement authority, staffing shortages, or delayed access to agency data. And oversight is often after the fact. Not preventative. The investigative findings here are that oversight exists, but it is not uniformly empowered, timely, or insulated from political pressure. Federal agencies themselves report improper payment rates in some programs exceeding 5 to 10% of total outlays in certain years, and tens of billions of dollars annually flagged as improperly paid. While improper payments are not synonymous with corruption, they do indicate weak internal controls, they indicate increased opportunity for fraud and abuse, and they indicate reduced detection certainty. Weak control environments are empirically associated with higher corruption risk in both the U.S. and international research. When looking at public trust and perception, this is contextual, not proof. There are long-term pollings that show low and declining trust in federal institutions. And majorities of respondents consistently believe corruption is widespread. Perception is not proof, but persistent distrust undermines transparency, whistleblowing, and accountability, indirectly increasing corruption risk. Systemic oversight weakness identified that oversight is reactive rather than preventative. Fragmentation is across agencies. There's inconsistent data transparency, limited real-time auditing, there's political interference risk, and there's a lack of standardized corruption metrics. More rigid oversight is necessary, according to an evidence-based conclusion. Peer-reviewed research and international evidence consistently shows increased audit frequency reduces corrupt behavior. Independent oversight reduces misconduct. Transparent reporting raises detection probability. And clear consequences alter cost-benefit calculations for corruption. In short, corruption decreases when the perceived likelihood of detection exceeds the perceived benefit of misconduct. Current U.S. oversight mechanisms do not consistently meet that threshold. We can state with evidence that corruption does exist within government agencies. We can state that hundreds of convictions annually confirm ongoing misconduct, that dozens of federal programs are officially classified at high risk, that oversight mechanisms exist, but they are uneven, underpowered, and they often very delayed. And we can state with evidence that there is no reliable percentage of total corruption because corruption is underdetected by nature. This research clearly supports that more rigid, independent, and preventative oversight would measurably reduce corruption. More rigid oversight would include stronger Inspector General authority, real-time auditing of high-risk programs, mandatory transparency in contracting and procurement, standardized corruption risk metrics across agencies, and protection and incentivization of whistleblowers. There is no definable claim that corruption is rare, nor that it is overwhelming, but evidence clearly shows it is persistent and it's structurally enabled where oversight is weak. The absence of a single percentage is not evidence of absence, it is evidence of limited visibility. And visibility, according to every credible study, is the single most effective deterrent to corruption. Corruption within government and federal agencies does not manifest as a single behavior, but rather as a spectrum of misconduct, ranging from financial improprieties to severe abuses of authority. Documented cases and oversight findings indicate that corruption risk spans the following categories. At the lower to moderate severity levels, corruption frequently involves fraud, theft, embezzlement, falsification of records, procurement manipulation, and misuse of public funds or authority for personal or organizational gain. These forms of corruption are most commonly identified through audits, financial reviews, and Inspector General investigations. More severe forms of corruption arise when authority, law enforcement power, or regulatory discretion are misused, including wrongful arrest, falsification of evidence, obstruction of justice, coercion, and abuse of investigative or prosecutorial authority. Such misconduct undermines due process. It erodes the public's trust, and it can result in significant civil rights violations. At the extreme end of the spectrum, historical investigations and criminal prosecutions demonstrate that corruption can intersect with organized criminal activity. This would include facilitation of drug trafficking, human trafficking, kidnapping, violent offenses, and in rare but documented cases, even homicide. These cases typically involve long-term oversight failures, compromised internal controls, and systemic breakdowns in detection and accountability. The existence of this spectrum underscores that corruption is not solely a financial or administrative issue. It is also a public safety and human rights concern when oversight mechanisms fail. Effective prevention, therefore, requires oversight systems capable of detecting not only financial anomalies, but also patterns of authority misuse, coercion, and institutional silence. This represents an evidence-based assessment of corruption risk within U.S. government and federal agencies, grounded exclusively in measurable indicators: criminal convictions, audit findings, inspector general reports, improper payment data, and institutional oversight structures. While no authoritative percentage of total corruption can be calculated, the convergence of these indicators demonstrates persistent misconduct risk amplified by fragmented, reactive, and insufficient oversight mechanisms. This concludes that more rigid, independent, and preventative oversight structures are necessary to measurably reduce corruption within federal systems. This analysis relies on verifiable, non-speculative sources and metrics, including the Department of Justice Public Corruption Conviction Data, Government Accountability Office High-Risk Program Reports, the Federal Inspector General's Audit and Investigative Summaries, Improper Payment and Program Integrity Reports, and Public Trust and Institutional Confidence Surveys. They are contextual only. This does not attempt to infer observable corruption prevalences. Instead, it evaluates corruption risk and detection effectiveness through institutional outputs and controls. The existing oversight mechanisms or oversight architecture in the federal government are Government Accountability Office, the GAO, Independent Audits and Evaluations, Advisory Authority only, Office of Inspector General, Internal Oversight with investigative and audit functions, the Department of Justice, Criminal Enforcement and High Evidentiary Thresholds, Congressional Oversight Committee, Policy and Budgetary Review, also they are politically contingent, and the Internal Agency Controls, which is compliance and ethics offices, and they have self-policing limitations. Looking at oversight failures, most federal oversight mechanisms operate post-incident, after funds have been misused or misconduct has occurred. Preventative real-time auditing remains limited to select programs. There's fragmentation of authority, so oversight responsibilities are dispersed across multiple entities with limited coordination. This results in gaps where misconduct can persist without detection. Limited enforcement power. Government Accountability Office recommendations are non-binding, and many Inspector General offices lack authority to compel corrective action, relying instead on agency leadership cooperation. And then there's political and structural constraints. Inspector Generals and oversight officials may face political pressure, delayed confirmations, or removal risks that undermine independence. Congressional oversight intensity fluctuates based on political alignment rather than risk prioritization. There's data transparency and access gaps. Oversight bodies frequently report delayed or restricted access to agency data systems, hindering timely detection or irregularities. There's inconsistent standards. There is no unified federal framework for measuring corruption risk, audit frequency, or oversight effectiveness across agencies. Empirical research and audit outcomes consistently demonstrate that increased audit frequency correlates with reduced misconduct, that independent oversight bodies improve compliance outcomes, that transparency increases detection probability and deference, and it demonstrates that clear consequences alter cost-benefit incentives for corrupt behavior. Policy recommendations would be to expand statutory authority and independence of Inspector General, to implement real-time auditing for high-risk programs, to standardize corruption risk metrics across federal agencies, to mandate transparent reporting of audit findings and corrective actions, to strengthen whistleblower protections and reporting incentives, and to integrate oversight data across agencies for systemic risk analysis. So again, the absence of a single percentage measure of corruption does not indicate absence of corruption. Rather, it reflects limited visibility resulting from structural oversight weakness. The evidence demonstrates that corruption persists where detection probability is low and oversight is fragmented. So strengthening, standardizing, and insulating oversight mechanisms is the most evidence-supported pathway to reducing corruption risk across federal agencies. The status of this is intended for policy analysis, oversight reform discussion, and institutional risk assessment. It is suitable for submission to governmental review bodies, academic policy forums, and transparency initiatives.